about IDRC's work on climate resilience and climate resilient food systems, gender equality, and social inclusion, as well as what guided us in designing this event. Idida, the floor is yours.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our listeners today. Let me just start with a quote. Now that I make decisions on my income, the sky is the limit. This is a statement made by Jovial Sarah Nabukela, a small-scale bean farmer in rural Uganda, living and producing on 2 acres of land. She explains that the bean crop is important for both food and income, and it's a main source of protein for her family. She also gets income to pay for her children's school fees and settle medical bills. About 3 years ago, prolonged droughts and erratic rainfall resulted in 2 persistent low yields, and her income suffered greatly, affecting her children's schooling, and she could not feed her family as before. During her struggle, Uganda's narrow research has introduced drought-tolerant bean varieties that were biofortified with iron. She was able to increase her production with improved varieties, and together with other members of her group, they were able to market in bulk and increase income as well as feed their families with nutritious food. When she started nursing a small baby, unfortunately, she relied on her husband, who worked off farm, to pick her payment, and for a couple of times, the money never reached her. This incentive reduced her production capacity until the day she received payment on her mobile phone and was motivated to reinvest in her bean enterprise. So Nabukela's story is an example of what we do in the IDRC's Climate Resilient Food Systems Division. To us, gender equality and inclusion is an end in and of itself, even though we acknowledge that it is a critical pathway for transforming food systems. So for our efforts to contribute to more inclusive, healthier, and climate resilient food systems involves this. We address underlying structural conditions and power relationships that exacerbate social and gender inequalities in food systems and that undermine the resilience of communities to climate change and other stressors. We do test, validate, and promote technical and social innovations that build the resilience of poor communities. And we bring to scale the use of proven innovations to empower marginalized farmers and ensure equitable access to nutritious food. We also generate knowledge and use it to improve future programming for gender and social inclusion. For example, we are currently testing the use of common tools across programs to measure the levels of women empowerment. For example, using the project-based Women Empowerment in Agriculture Index and the Women Empowerment in Livestock Index tools that are developed by IFPRI. Lessons that we draw tell us what tools to work best and under which context, among other things, so which helps us to continue programming to how we can better address gender and social inclusion. Given our mandate on gender and social inclusion, therefore, in research for development programs and projects, we do not fund projects that are gender blind. We don't invest in that area. Gender and inclusion, so we realize gender and inclusion this way. Some of the projects that we fund integrate gender and social inclusion. And the extent to which they integrate could be that they are gender sensitive, they are gender responsive, but the best of all is that they are gender transformative. This still gives us an opportunity to learn. By taking these different continuums, it helps us to still learn and then keep on improving. For example, like all the speakers that we are going to listen to today are speakers that have been integrating gender and inclusion. We also have projects that specifically and programs that specifically address gender inequalities and inclusion. For example, we have the Livestock Innovation Fund, a 7-year multi-million-dollar partnership with Global Affairs Canada and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which works on gender-inclusive vaccine supply chains. These projects that are specific to gender and inclusion, they are led by gender experts, and their core research is focused on addressing gender inequalities for this program on animal health and vaccine delivery. So despite the achievements we have made, we still see that evidence-based solutions that integrate gender and social inclusion that address gender power imbalances at scale are a key component to the transformation of the climate resilient food systems. They are critical, but they are still lacking. Our future programming will combine development of these innovations, but we also want to test scaling strategies for achieving impact at scale. So why are we here today? Our panel today is constituted by a set of projects operating across the continent. They have one thing in common. The science have developed and implemented innovations that increase women's agency to deal with the constraining norms and social structures. As a result, women have been empowered and able to make contributions to improve their resilience in their respective value chains across the different contexts. Our panel speakers will be sharing with us their experiences on how they are supporting the inclusion of women to enhance resilience in the agricultural value chains. Thank you so much. Back to you, Julie.
Thank you, Edita, for setting the stage in such an inspiring way. And dear panelists, once again, a warm welcome with us this morning. As you know very clearly now, we are all interested to know what were the most important results of your research in terms of gender equality and social inclusion in agriculture and in agriculture value chain, and how gender equality and social inclusion contributes to resilience. So feel free to respond in either French or English. It is at your convenience. So we'll start with Professor Redouane Choufrala. You are an agronomist. You hold a PhD in environmental horticulture, and you have worked several years at the Institute of Agronomy and Veterinary, Hassan II, as well as at the International Center for Biosaline Agriculture, ICBA, in addition to leading on numerous water resources sustainability projects. Redouane, we would love to hear more about the results of your project involving quinoa in poor rural community in Morocco. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you and to share some of the results of our project related to scaling up quinoa value chain to improve food and nutrition security in the rural area, and particularly in Morocco. So why quinoa? I think this is a very important question before I can give you some results and share with you some of the results we had. So why quinoa? Most important, it's that quinoa, it's what do you call, an important crop, would have very good nutrition. It's a very drought tolerant. So we use that crop to improve the livelihood of the rural and poor population. So we decide to implement this project in one of the regions in Morocco called Arhamna. So next one. So next. So the Arhamna is well known by a very dry area. Next. And also the rainfall, it's very low. And most important things, it's that we had a high rural population with the big poverty. So, and another thing very important, it's in this region, we had a cactus that was totally devastated by an insect. So to resolve this problem, we choose this quinoa crop and to be introduced in the region. So we decided to investigate some of the potentiality of this crop in the region. So one of the main results of this crop, it's one important thing, it allowed to increase yield by introducing new varieties. And also one of the most important things we had, it's that the revenue of those farmers was improved. Why? Because the price of quinoa was much more higher than any cereal that was grown in the area. So also one of the results we come up from this project, it's that we created almost 6 community women cooperatives that was able to change their processing from a very traditional way to a very what we call modern way, an accepted way in order to be sold at the market. And one of the most important things at the processor level, and there was a limiting factor, it was the saponin content. So at the beginning, it was do it manually and by washing, but we introduced a machine that was able to reduce the time and the cost for removing the saponin in this crop, what was a big handicap for selling the crop in the market, and was able to compete. Also, one of the things that result that we had in this project, it was that we also introduced the best practices, which allowed us to come up with a higher yield of the crops. So one of the quotes that I would like to say from this that come up from some of the farmers, the women farmers that were helped to improve their processing of the quinoa. It's that the president said, our cooperative was created in a rural area suffering of poverty. The project allowed the cooperative gathered poor women from the area and gave them a job. We started recently using quinoa to make a gluten-free couscous, thanks to the project. The other quotes, it's one of the women that have almost 60 years, and she's an expert in preparing couscous. She said that their profit has increased significantly since they began adding quinoa to their product. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you so much, Redouane. And you're not going anywhere, of course. We will have other rounds of questions, and we'll learn more about the quinoa project that you're referencing. Extremely interesting, I must admit. So now we'll turn to Mrs. Grace Nayonyo. You are a gender specialist, also with a background in horticulture. You are a fellow under the Gender Responsive Researchers Equipped for Agricultural Transformation, GREAT project, which is implemented by the Cornell and Makerere universities. And you are currently working with the National Agricultural Research Organization, NARA. Today, Grace, you are here to share with us the findings of the pre-cooked beans project of IDRC's CULTIAF, or Cultivate Africa's Future, a program co-funded by the Australian Centre for International Agriculture Research. Grace, we're all ears.
Yeah, thank you so much, Julie. Grace Nanyonjo is still my name. I'll be presenting on behalf of the Pre-Cooked Beans Project, which aimed at scaling up supply and utilization of pre-cooked beans for improved food and nutrition security. In doing that, the project employed several inclusive and responsive interventions that included, among others, capacity building in good agronomic practices and collective marketing. These interventions reached and benefited over 5,000 women and 5,000 men. And this benefited in terms of increased access to drought-tolerant biofortified bean varieties with pre-cooking traits, in terms of increased production, and in terms of enabling their access to better markets. Now, did you know that women are tech-innovative? Did you know that women, once hooked on digital technologies, they can make better use of them? Secondly, or thirdly, did you also know that digital technologies have the potential to empower rural women? Now, the Pre-Cooked Beans Project developed a MasterCard farmer network that registered over 10,000 women and 7,000 men on that mobile-based digital platform. It also trained about 50 locals, of which 60%, of whom 60% were youth, to implement this technology. Now, in terms of impact of the technology, in terms of impact of the project improved access of over 10,000 farmers, 6 of whom are women, to improved bean seed varieties. And these varieties have traits for pre-cooking. So in doing that, productivity increased, and just to know, food and nutrition security were secured at the household level. Secondly, the technology of pre-cooking, in the process, women participation in bean marketing was increased by 86%. Just imagine. Importantly, the project significantly increased income of over 68% of its targeted beneficiaries, and 60% of whom were women. Now, do you know that when the project increased the income of rural women to over 68%, it was still observed that women were losing control over this income to their spouses. That's how this prompted the project to develop this innovation, the MasterCard Farmer Network, that made sure that all income coming from sale of beans was paid directly to the funds or to bank accounts of men and women. Guess what? This increased women control over this income. It gave them sense of ownership over this income, increased their independence and autonomy as entrepreneurs in business. Guess what? Many women farmers, like sorts of Nabukera, Dr. Edida was talking about, they can bear witness on how this technology has made their households food secure, nutrition secure, and income secure. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Grace. This is extremely interesting. I must say, I'm very impressed by all those results that you've shared with us. We'll now turn to Dr. Andrew Wardell. Dr. Wardell, you have a background in agricultural botany, forestry, and philosophy related to environmental history. For the past 38 years, you have worked on various projects on nature resource governance, capacity development, and finance issues in Southeast Asia, as well as Sub-Saharan Africa. Andrew, we would be very interested to hear about the results of your research project involving women Shea producers and Shea parklands in Burkina Faso. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Julie. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. The story that I'm going to tell relates to a food tree crop that is called Shea, the Vitellaria paradoxa, and which is distinguished by its long history, 700 years of documented history. It has been a gendered value chain. And it is really only in the last 20 years that that value chain, which has been controlled, managed by women almost exclusively, has started to be restructured. as an oligarchy controlled by a small number of transnational corporations after 2000 has started to control the global market as demand for what are called cocoa butter equivalents has increased. In addition to that, shea, in terms of its importance, is critical source of vegetable oil to between 16 and 18 million women in a band of about 3.5 million square kilometers, stretching from Senegal all the way across to Uganda in the Sudano-Sahelian belt. But what I want to highlight in relation to the project that was financed by IDRC and the Forest Trees and Agroforestry program of the CGIAR relates to our key findings, which discovered by adopting a longue durée historical approach to the governance of value chains, discovered that despite a plethora of women in development and gender projects since the 1980s, widespread degradation of the agroforestry parklands in Burkina Faso has occurred due to a composite of many factors, including population growth, internal migration, use of shea as a firewood, and also in charcoal making, reduced fallows, increased mechanization, and factors all of which have been exacerbated by climate change. The long history of women in development and gender projects focused predominantly on introducing new technologies, strengthening the capacities of women's groups, improving the quality of processing of shea butter particularly, and increasing market access, but ironically did little, if anything, to either protect or restore the agroforestry parklands. Why is this important? For two reasons. In the current global interest in forest landscape restoration, it's been estimated that current restoration efforts in Burkina Faso are only meeting 2% of the national targets that were set by the government by 2030, and this is already by 2021. How did we get to this key result? We started out with a national inception workshop, which tried to bring together and co-identify with all the key actor groups representing government, women's producer associations, private sector actors, the transnational corporations, to try and identify what was in a very crowded space, the research priorities for us, which focused on the one hand in terms of capacity development, where we trained 3 master students at the University Nazi Boni, the Institut de Développement Rural in Bobo-Dioulasso, as well as working with 2 other Burkinabe researchers, one of whom was engaged in her PhD research and the other one who she had already completed her PhD. And I think the advantage of this approach by adopting the longue durée, it enabled us to compare and contrast 2 waves of globalized trade during both the colonial era and the more recent post-2000 significant increase in global demand for cocoa butter equivalents. I'll stop here, Julie, and then in the next session go on to talk about some of the challenges we also faced. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. No, extremely rich first interventions from all of you. I have noted on my old-fashioned pad of paper here that I guess all 3 projects have been having success in terms of selecting crops that are adapted to the environment, drought resistant in some cases, but also that are going to be helping with environmental degradation, climate change, or be mindful of that situation. That also there's been a lot of emphasis put on capacity building in terms of marketing, access to new markets as well, the added value component of the crops that were selected, and of course the integration of technology, enabling the improvement of the livelihood of women involved in these agricultural value chain. So we'll just move on to more questions, and we have one for you, Grace. We were wondering if you could tell us more about the importance of engagement with the private sector in terms of scaling research uptake and gender equality, of course.
Thank you so much, Julie. Now, what I have to say is that strategic public-private partnership with a gender lens has had critical impacts on the pre-cooked beans project. The project engaged over 20 partners, including women-owned businesses. For example, Smart Logistics in Kenya, East African Development Company Limited, that is in Uganda. So that means that public-private partnership provided business opportunities for women-owned businesses to tap into low-hanging fruits of scaling up the product, which is pre-cooked. So it gave them this opportunity, and I can tell you that women are now thriving in business because of that. Secondly, engaging the Community Enterprise Development Organization, which is still a woman-owned business, as a seed of taker under the seed credit model, where men, women, and youth were given seed on credit based on their production capabilities and then paid back after harvesting. So this wasn't based on their age, on their sex status, anything, but was based on their production capabilities. So this arrangement increased access, increased availability, access, and utilization of the pre-cooked bean, of the varieties that had pre-cooking traits. So with increased access to these varieties, that meant increased productivity. And when this increased, that means we were able to reduce the seed access gap. We are able to reduce the gender yield gap in bean production. Thirdly, engaging with financial institutions such as banks and mobile money agents. Under the MasterCard Farmer Initiative, we increase opportunities for women farmers, for youth farmers to access credit, moreover, without any security needed, but based on financial transactions that had accumulated. Guess what? This reduced the gender-based barriers that restricted women farmers from accessing credit. And you know, when we did this, women participation in bean production, of these varieties that had pre-cooking qualities, I'm telling you, it increased seriously. Lastly, working closely with the government, with the community leaders throughout the implementation of the project, it increased community buy-in, community acceptance of the pre-cooked bean products, acceptance of the varieties that had pre-cooking traits. Remember, these were new varieties that were introduced into the community. So that really increased acceptance and buy-in, and it was really a smooth process. And also, the more we increased awareness of these leaders about the gender issues that were impeding women participation into production of these varieties, I'm telling you, very many volunteered as champions to be the change gender agents in their communities. And this, you know, removed the barriers to women's meaningful participation in agricultural value chains. And we also had bylaws that improved uptake of these varieties in the communities. So what I have to say is that public-private partnerships enabled vulnerable groups, especially women, to get that sense of security and independence over this income that they get, that maximizing benefits for women in terms of reach, benefit, and empowerment. One important thing that I have to say is that public-private partnership is an evidence-based solution to increasing women's resilience in agricultural value chains. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Grace. And Andrew, you are, of course, welcome to tell us more about the results that you've achieved through the project, but also perhaps what are the challenges that you faced during COVID-19 and how has this impacted the research uptake and engagement with national decision makers?
Thank you, Julie, for this question. I think we can describe what we faced when we started the project as a perfect storm. Because not only did we face problems associated with the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic, but we also faced all the problems associated with insecurity in the country as Burkina Faso became the epicenter of the problems in West Africa associated with some of the rebel groups. This made life very, very difficult for the project and the project staff. Just to give you some idea of the context that we are now living in Burkina Faso, there are anything between 1.1 and 1.5 million internally displaced people who've moved from the north and the east, affecting 7 out of 13 regions. 53% of them are women. 2,500 schools have been closed, and 2.1 million people are now food insecure. This is the context within which we were working, before I even start talking about the COVID-19. And so obviously the insecurity particularly affected the collection of shea nuts because of the insecurity for women, but they have adapted. Many women have now started to collect the shea nuts accompanied by their husbands or other men in the families. They sometimes burn down the areas to reduce the risk that people can hide, and several other adaptations. But in addition to that, the impacts of the COVID-19 were essentially to reduce mobility, which also affected collecting nuts, but also the processing and marketing of the shea nuts and the shea butter. It reduced cross-border trade with Ghana, for example, for women. There was reduced global demand, but compensated to some extent by increased local demand. Nevertheless, there has been a surplus of shea nuts that women producer groups have not been able to sell. There have been delays in shipping and increased costs associated with the global trade. And this has resulted in indebtedness of many women's shea groups. And don't forget, in Burkina, there are some 2,000 professionally organized women's shea producer groups in the country, as well as their federated structures, representing more than 600,000 households who depend on this as a source of income. So the COVID-19 pandemic particularly affected the processing and transformation, but the insecurity particularly affected the collecting and the production. But in terms of our responses to this, you can see in the slide, I've tried to summarize all the different initiatives that the government has taken, to their credit, to address these, including the establishment of 2 funds. One, particularly a solidarity fund for women, but at this stage it's too early to know to what extent these funds have actually been dispersed to women's groups to actually know what their impact has been. But our particular project, supported by RDC, I think our biggest achievement was actually to co-host a national shea forum with the Ministry of Environment, Green Economy and Climate Change in Ouagadougou on the 24th and 25th of June this year, which brought together 180 participants representing, again, all the shea producer groups and involved in the shea value chain, and which led to a 10-point call to action that has been transmitted at the highest level to the government, which focuses on this key research result of actually strengthening the restoration of the parklands. Given the historical lesson that if you don't have a resource base, you don't have women's groups. And this is why I think it's critically important that we think beyond simply gender or women in development, because both men and women may be knowledgeable about the processes associated with shea tree management. And hence we need a more fluid conception of how knowledge about these parklands is developed and circulated within the household. And here I'm drawing on my Canadian colleague, Marlene Elias, who I'm presenting on behalf of, as well as my Burkinabe colleagues, Mathieu Anzida and Aïcha Tapsoba from the National Research Institute, INERA. So thank you very much. I hope I've addressed your question, Julie.
Indeed, thank you so much, Andrew. Very challenging context to operate in, but also encouraging to see that there are important steps and impactful ones that are taken in terms of the impact of those findings that you've had in addressing those challenges. So thank you for that. Redouane, we were wondering what lessons can you draw from your research to inform gender inclusive, resilient value chains for the future?
Okay. One of the most lessons to be learned from our project is you cannot empower the gender without empowering all the actors of the whole value chain. All the components of the value chain, including production, processing, and marketing are strongly linked. So therefore, gender inclusive, resilient value chain was reached in our project by upgrading the production, by upgrading the processing, and by opening up the market for this new crop in Morocco. So the take-home message is, without intervening at the whole component of the whole quinoa value chain, you cannot empower women that was mainly involved in the processing phase. So scaling up quinoa value chain to improve food and nutritional security in poor rural community of Morocco, we need continuous training for man and woman farmer about quinoa best cropping practice by extension service, enhancing public awareness on the nutrition health benefit of quinoa is a key for resilient value chain, government commitment toward food security, women's inclusion, and helping farmer association through policy provision. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Redouane. Well, we've been receiving questions while we were chatting, and the first question from the audience is one that is addressed to all three of you. It goes as follows. We're interested to know, were there ripple effects on policymakers which were encouraged to implement better policies for women beyond your project, your good or your commodity? I believe Andrew has started to talk a little bit about that already. So maybe we start with you, Andrew, and then we'll proceed with Redouane and Grace.
Thank you very much. A very good question. Yes, I think the most significant policy shift that we've seen, which I can't say is attributable to our project, but our project has possibly contributed to, is this policy shift to recognize the critical importance of restoring and regenerating the parklands. Given the sort of 30, 40-year history of other types of project interventions, I think that's probably the most significant contribution. But I would qualify it by admitting that one of the weaknesses, as is always the case in any research project, is the extent to which we've been able to address other key policy concerns. And I want to cite, just as an example, the critical challenge we face in a country like Burkina, where cotton is still one of the main export crops. Cotton is a huge user of agrochemicals and has had a profound influence on bee colonies in the eastern parts of the country. Bees are critical for pollination and one of the many ecosystem services that are provided by the agroforestry parklands. So there is still need for us to challenge some of the policy incoherence that may exist at a national level. So I hope that answers the question as briefly as possible, Julie.
Thank you, Andrew. Indeed, it does. Redouane, have you noticed any ripple effects on policymakers through the Quinoa project?
Well, I think, first of all, Quinoa project, I think, fit within the strategy of Morocco, what we called before the Moroccan Agriculture Green Plan. Now we have a new program called the Green Generation. And in this program, the government is trying to help basically the rural poor community, and particularly in agriculture sectors. And one of the policy that has been done is to subsidize some of the equipment to upgrade all the components of the value chain. And the approach of the value chain now, it's starting to be part of the whole policy of Moroccan government, because it has been demonstrated not through our project and also through other projects that the intervening only on one part of the value chain will not help in developing the agriculture sector in Morocco.
Thank you so much. Grace, in your previous interventions, you referred a lot to public-private partnerships, and I'm wondering if this could not be an area where there's been ripple effects in terms of the project, but feel free to touch on all of those that you've seen in terms of the effects on policymaking.
Thank you so much. What I can say is that, when we introduced these varieties that have free cooking traits, these varieties are also very rich in iron and zinc, with a really huge potential to contribute to a reduction in malnutrition in Uganda. In Uganda, we have so many communities, especially the Karamoja region, whose malnutrition levels are really overwhelming. So now the government of Uganda has taken on those varieties as priority crops to be promoted in those regions. Secondly, World Food Program, FAO, when distributing beans to refugee communities and even other vulnerable communities, those varieties become #1 on the list. And very soon the government is going to pass a policy to make it a must that all schools in Uganda, all institutions and colleges, they feed their pupils, students, and students on biofortified bean varieties, which happen to be the varieties that we are promoting for pre-cooking. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Grace. And we have another question from the audience, this time related to the private sector. We've already discussed how important it is to engage with the private sector for women's empowerment, but are there risks also that we should be mindful of when developing projects? For example, Andrew's project started from a situation where the private sector had created an oligarchy that did not benefit women's cooperatives. So how do we handle or manage those risks in terms of engaging with the private sector? Perhaps I'll turn first to Andrew once again.
Thank you very much, Julie. I think it's a double-edged sword. I don't think we can ignore even the big players when it comes to the private sector. But I think it's ways in which we engage with them to try and help orient shifts in policy. Even if the three biggest players in the global shea industry in terms of the production of cocoa butter equivalents, who supply essentially the confectionery industry. I noted in the discussion, somebody was talking about the cosmetic industry. That represents only 10% of the trade. 90% of the trade from Burkina Faso of what is exported as either shea nuts, which are unprocessed, or shea butter, which is processed, the handcrafted shea butter as it's called, represents 90% of the global trade. It's for the confectionery industry. I think one of the positive impacts we've seen of engaging with some of the big players, even if they still do constitute an oligarchy, is that they have the resources to invest, for example, in additional research activities. And this is certainly the case with one of the big players, Aarhus Olie Calcium, which is a Danish-Swedish consortium that was merged in 2005, which still represents the largest single buyer of shea nuts from Burkina Faso. But they have recently invested in a research center, which has as its main objective to propagate and develop new propagation techniques to increase the planting of shea trees in the parklands. So I think there are both sides that need to be looked at. We certainly, at the beginning of the project in the National Inception Workshop, tried to be as open as possible to engage with all actor groups. There are others who provide services. So, for example, EcoCert is one of the big certifiers, and this is something which is growing slowly in Burkina Faso to certify both the parklands, but also the shea products. So there are many different ways in which we can engage. There is, however, I would say at the government level, some resistance to working with the big transnational corporations because they still see large quantities of unprocessed nuts being exported from the country. So this remains a challenge.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Redouane, over to you. In the Quinoa project, there was an important part dedicated to the marketing and the market access that could have created tensions, perhaps in terms of interactions with the private sector, or other types of risks that could have been generated by the project. Over to you to tell us more about that.
Okay, I think private sector is part of the whole value chain. It's very important. They could play a big role. For example, I'll give you a good example in our project. The 5 new variety of quinoa that were introduced with higher yield than the local variety were registered at the national catalog, then transferred to local private seed production, because it's very important to have them. The same thing for the mechanized tool that were used for reducing the cost of production and also the cost of processing, were manufactured by a local private company. So I think the implication of the private sector, it's a crucial and it's part of all the actor of the value chain. So I think in terms even of marketing, we have to introduce our crop within what we call the big supermarkets, and there we have to make some kind of a convention or in order to have a space in an area where there is more people to come in order to sell all this product that was produced by those women cooperative.
Thank you so much, Redouane. Grace, you've talked already about the interactions in terms of the project with the private sector, but were there any risks that perhaps you've encountered and overcome throughout the project?
Yeah, sure. You know, working with the private sector, it is not something easy because for them, what they really mind about is the income. How they get it is, actually, it is the profit. So how they get it, it is not none of their business as long as they maximize their profits. But how we've been able to overcome that, continuous monitoring, and also signing a memorandum of understanding with them with clear articulation of the roles and what we expect from them, I think that really helped.
And were there any trade-offs that were met, and how were you able to address them throughout the project in terms of anticipated benefits perhaps, or challenges?
Julie, like I said, that when you do, you know, periodic monitoring of your progress vis-a-vis the planned or expected output and outcomes, it really helps you monitor, come back and sit and discuss with them, and you know, you see, especially what we really made sure is that we don't compromise benefits to the women. That was a priority.
Thank you so much. We have now reached the end of the discussion with all of you, but we have with us Mercy, who will be telling us a little bit more about what are the lessons that can be drawn from these projects, but also many others that IDRC supported throughout the years. So Mercy, we're delighted to have you on board with us to help us identify what are the key learnings that we've made throughout the years, and what are those learnings that can guide our present and future work.
Thank you, Julie, for this opportunity. I'm going to mention three key learnings that we can take from here. Number one is that in times of crisis, that is when we must be most vigilant about gender and social inclusion. And as Burkina Faso has shown us and demonstrated, some countries could have a multiplicity of shocks, right? And so this could be COVID-19, for instance, there could be climatic extremes or insecurity. And this calls for flexibility and adjustments because some of these projects were developed before all these shocks happened. And so to address those issues, we have to have some flexibility and adjustments to these projects. But what is critical is to ensure that women, youth, and other social groups are not dropped as other priorities take center stage. Because should this happen, what we risk is leaving too many people behind and pushing them further into poverty. And this would make it more difficult for us to build back better. So whether it is moving to digital platforms for training and extension, whether we are looking at payments for supplies, whether we are developing stimulus packages or financing mechanisms, or we are looking at remodeling supply chains for smallholder farmers, inclusion must remain at the forefront of interventions in times of crisis. Number two, there is a saying that one with no destination cannot get lost. It is imperative, as all these projects have shown us, to have a very intentional and deliberate strategy on gender and social inclusion. And whether you want to be transformative, responsive, or sensitive, you must have a very deliberate approach. As these issues challenge, as we all know, social structures and social norms, and they challenge policies, whether at national or local levels, and in fact, challenge some of the policies also within private sector, it is important to understand what the disempowering factors are in order to design interventions that address them. But this takes time, and it also takes a multiplicity of partners to achieve. And the Pre-Cooked Beans has demonstrated with the e-payment platform that a well-designed intervention with a good mix of research, private sector, and community training can put income into the hands, directly into the hands of women. And this allows for better access to inputs, better education for the children, better living conditions, greater food security, and enhances a culture of savings and investment for the future, thereby improving livelihoods. And number three, the third lesson I would like to mention is that having a gender expert or an inclusion expert on the team is not enough. It is important that the whole team, the whole project team, is trained on gender and social inclusion. And this would raise their awareness on why these issues are important. And this helps the teams to recognize when their interventions are gender blind or devoid of inclusion. And this goes both in turn for the funding organization as well as the projects that we support. Now, this common or shared understanding would help to develop indicators, objectives, budgets that are cognizant of the integration of women, youth, and other social groups. And this would happen throughout the project rather than have a loose mention that is not backed up by analysis or any particular strategy. So those are the three key lessons I would like to mention this morning. Thank you, Julie.
Merci, thank you very much to you. I think you wrapped up our discussion in a very meaningful way, very relevant recommendations, I think, in terms of the learning. We have indeed come to the end of our session. So I will simply offer some thanks, first of all, to our three panelists, Professor Redwan Chukwala, Mrs. Grace Nayonjo, and Dr. Andrew Wardell. Thank you so much for your generous time, enthusiasm, and accepting this invitation. Your expertise has been extremely valuable to all of us, and we wish you continued success in your ongoing research work. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Warm thanks also to my colleagues Edida and Mercy for sharing their experience and knowledge which contributed to making this event and enriching one as well. And thanks to my colleague Michele, who without this event would not have taken place. So a huge thanks to you for your leadership and patience and dedication in building the resilience of agricultural value chain and gender equity and social inclusion. Last but not least, thanks to the interpreter and technical experts who helped us this morning. And to you all who participate in the discussion, we were delighted to host you on a topic that is of critical importance to IDRC. We sincerely hope that you benefit from these exchanges and that it can inspire and contribute to your own project. So on that note, I wish you all an excellent continuation of your side event day at the AGRF, as well as an excellent forum. So au revoir, merci, goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.